The morning air bit cold as Emma Clark pulled her old navy jacket tighter around her thin frame. She stood at the bus stop on Maple Street, waiting for the number 12 that would take her to downtown, where she worked as a cleaner at the Preston Hotel. The jacket had seen better days. The fabric was faded in patches, the zipper sometimes stuck halfway, and the cuffs were frayed from years of wear. But it was warm, and more importantly, it was all she had. Emma was 42 years old, though the hard years had etched lines on her face that made her look older. She lived alone in a small studio apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their heads down and minded their own business. Her life was simple and predictable. She woke at 5 each morning, caught the bus by 6, and worked until 3 in the afternoon. Then she'd go home, heat up something simple for dinner, and fall asleep watching old movies on her tiny television. She didn't ask for much from life anymore. Once, many years ago, she had dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, to help children learn and grow, but life had other plans. Her mother got sick when Emma was 19, and she dropped out of college to take care of her. Then came the bills, the debt, the endless cycle of working just to stay afloat. Her mother passed away 5 years later, leaving Emma alone with memories and responsibilities that had crushed her dreams into dust. The bus arrived with a screech of brakes and a puff of dark exhaust. Emma climbed aboard, swiping her worn transit card and taking her usual seat near the back. The bus was half full with other early morning workers, nurses heading to the hospital, cooks going to restaurants, security guards ending their night shifts. Nobody paid her any attention. She was invisible, just another tired face in a city full of them. As the bus rumbled through the streets, Emma stared out the window at the awakening city. Shop owners rolled up metal shutters. Coffee shops flicked on their neon signs. Joggers ran past with their expensive headphones and designer athletic wear. Emma wondered sometimes what it would be like to have enough money to worry about which gym membership to buy or which coffee blend tasted best. For her, coffee was whatever generic brand was on sale at the dollar store. The Preston Hotel rose 20 stories into the sky, all glass and steel and luxury. Emma entered through the service entrance in the back alley, scanning her employee badge and trudging down the concrete stairs to the basement where the staff locker room was located. She changed into her cleaning uniform, a gray dress with the hotel logo embroidered on the chest, and comfortable shoes that had been white once but were now a dingy cream color. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was already assigning rooms when Emma arrived at the housekeeping office. Mrs. Chen was a stern woman in her 50s who ran the cleaning staff with military precision. She didn't tolerate lateness, laziness, or excuses. But she was fair, and she'd never treated Emma badly. That was more than Emma could say for some of the other managers she'd worked for over the years. Emma was assigned the 17th floor that day, 12 rooms to clean before her shift ended. She loaded her cart with fresh linens, towels, toiletries, and cleaning supplies, then wheeled it to the service elevator. The work was hard but familiar. Strip the beds, scrub the bathrooms, vacuum the carpets, dust every surface, restock everything. Repeat. Her hands were rough and red from the chemicals, and her back ached constantly, but she never complained. Complaining didn't pay the bills. By noon, she'd finished 8 rooms and was ahead of schedule. She allowed herself a 15-minute break in the staff room, eating the peanut butter sandwich she'd packed that morning and drinking water from the fountain. 2 other cleaners were there, younger women who chatted about their plans for the weekend. Emma listened but didn't join in. She had no weekend plans except laundry and maybe a walk to the library if the weather was nice. She was finishing her 9th room when she heard voices in the hallway. Loud voices. Laughing voices. Emma peeked out to see a group of women in their 30s and 40s, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying shopping bags from high-end stores. Hotel guests, clearly, and from the way they were talking, they'd been drinking at lunch. Emma tried to make herself small, keeping her head down as she pushed her cart toward the next room. But she wasn't fast enough. One of the women, a blonde in a designer dress and heels that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent, noticed her. The woman's eyes swept over Emma dismissively, landing on her jacket. Emma had thrown it over her cart because the hallways were cold. She always kept it close, even though wearing personal items during work hours was technically against the rules. The blonde woman nudged her friend and said something in a low voice. They both looked at Emma's jacket and giggled. Then another woman in the group noticed and joined in. Soon all 5 of them were staring at Emma and her jacket, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. Emma felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and vanish. But she had a job to do, and she needed this job, so she kept her head down and tried to move past them. The blonde woman stepped into her path. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it, the kind of smile that promised humiliation. Emma stopped, her hands gripping the handle of her cleaning cart so tightly her knuckles went white. She looked up at the woman, trying to keep her expression neutral. Years of dealing with difficult people had taught her that showing emotion only made things worse. The blonde woman reached out and actually touched Emma's jacket, pinching the worn fabric between her manicured fingers like it was something dirty. Her friends crowded closer, a semicircle of wealth and privilege surrounding the tired cleaning woman in the hotel hallway. One of them, a redhead in leather pants and a silk blouse, wrinkled her nose. Another, wearing enough jewelry to feed Emma for a year, actually took out her phone and snapped a picture. They were all laughing now, not even trying to hide it. Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That this jacket meant something to her? That it had belonged to someone important? They wouldn't care. People like this never cared about the stories behind worn clothes and tired faces. The blonde woman let go of the jacket and wiped her fingers on her dress dramatically, as if touching it had contaminated her somehow. Her friends howled with laughter. One of them said something about charity shops, and another made a joke about homeless people. Emma felt each word like a physical blow. She tried again to push past them, but the blonde woman shifted, blocking her path. The game wasn't over yet. These women were bored, probably tipsy from their expensive lunch, and they'd found entertainment in tormenting someone who couldn't fight back. That's when Emma heard the elevator ding behind her. She didn't turn around. She was too focused on trying to hold back the tears that were burning behind her eyes, trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. The women were still laughing, still making comments about her appearance, her jacket, her obvious poverty. Then the laughter stopped. Abruptly. Completely. The change was so sudden that Emma finally looked up. The women's faces had transformed from cruel amusement to something else, shock, maybe even fear. Their eyes were fixed on something behind Emma. Emma turned slowly. A man stood there, having just stepped out of the elevator. He was tall, in his 60s, with silver hair and a rigid posture that spoke of years of discipline. He wore a formal military uniform, decorated with ribbons and medals that caught the light. But what caught Emma's attention was his face. It had gone pale, almost gray, and his eyes were locked not on the group of women, but on her jacket. More specifically, on a small patch sewn onto the upper left sleeve of her jacket. It was faded and worn like everything else about the garment. But Emma's fingers unconsciously moved to touch it. The patch showed an eagle clutching arrows, the emblem barely visible after so many years. The general, because that's clearly what he was, based on the stars on his uniform, took a step forward. Then another. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as if he were fighting to stay upright. His jaw clenched and unclenched. One hand reached out, trembling slightly, pointing at the patch. The blonde woman and her friends had gone completely silent now. They'd backed away, sensing that something serious was happening, something they didn't understand. The cruel entertainment of moments ago had evaporated, replaced by confusion and growing unease. The general's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, barely above a whisper. He asked Emma where she got that jacket. Not demanded, asked. There was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't idle curiosity or another person judging her shabby appearance. This was something deeper, something that mattered in a way that Emma couldn't quite grasp. She opened her mouth to answer, but found her voice had abandoned her. The general took another step closer, and Emma could see his eyes more clearly now. They were gray, like storm clouds, and they were wet with tears that he was fighting hard to control. His entire body was tense, every muscle locked, as if he were standing at attention through sheer force of will while something inside him crumbled. The patch. He kept staring at the patch. Emma's hand covered it protectively, an automatic gesture. This patch, This tiny piece of fabric that most people never even noticed, meant everything to her. It was all she had left. It was memory and love and loss all sewn into a few square inches of faded cloth. The general seemed to understand her protective gesture. He took a deep breath, visibly composing himself, then spoke again. This time his voice was steadier, but the emotion beneath it was still clear. He asked again about the jacket, but differently now. He asked if she knew whose it had been before hers. He asked if she knew the name on the tag inside. He asked if she knew what that patch meant. Emma nodded slowly. Yes, she knew. The jacket had belonged to her brother. Her younger brother, Daniel. The brother who had joined the military at 18, with stars in his eyes and dreams of serving his country. The brother who had written her letters from basic training, full of hope and pride and excitement about his future. The brother who had deployed to a war zone and never came home. The hotel hallway seemed to shrink, the world narrowing down to just Emma and this general and the jacket between them. The group of women had faded into the background, forgotten. Emma could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, feel the blood pounding through her veins. Something was happening, something important, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. The general's face had transformed. The rigid control was cracking, breaking apart like ice under pressure. Tears were streaming down his face now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He asked Emma her last name. When she told him Clark, he actually staggered backward, catching himself against the wall. He knew Daniel. He had known her brother. The words came out of him in a rush, tumbling over each other. He said Daniel's name with a reverence that made Emma's own tears finally spill over. He said he had served with Daniel, that Daniel had been in his unit, that Daniel had been one of the finest young soldiers he'd ever had the honor to command. Emma's legs felt weak. She'd known her brother had been respected, that he'd been good at what he did. The military had told her that much when they came to inform her of his death. But hearing it from this general, seeing the raw emotion on his face, made it real in a way it had never been before. For 12 years, Daniel had been a painful memory, a ghost that haunted her quiet apartment and her lonely life. Now, suddenly, he was real again, brought back to life by this stranger's tears. The general told her more. He spoke about a mission, about danger, about a split-second decision that had changed everything. He spoke about courage and sacrifice and the kind of person Daniel had been. Other people had gathered now, hotel staff, curious guests, someone who might have been a manager, but nobody interrupted. The general's voice commanded attention even as it broke with emotion, and everyone could sense they were witnessing something profound. Emma listened, her own tears falling freely now, her hand still clutching the patch on her brother's jacket. The jacket she'd worn for 12 years, through cold winters and hard times, refusing to let it go even when it became threadbare, and people looked at her with pity, or, like today, with contempt. This jacket was all she had of Daniel. It was the only thing the military had returned that still smelled like him, that still carried his presence. She'd worn it until that smell faded, until her own scent replaced his, but she never stopped wearing it. The general explained about the patch, the unit insignia that Daniel had earned. He explained what it meant to wear that patch, what kind of soldier you had to be to receive it. He spoke with such pride that Emma felt her heart might burst. Her little brother, who she'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and worried about constantly, had become someone extraordinary. She'd always known he was special, but hearing it confirmed by this decorated general made the loss somehow both more bearable and more painful at the same time. Then the general said something that changed everything. He said he owed Daniel his life, that Daniel had saved him and 6 other soldiers during that last mission, that Daniel had seen danger coming and had acted without hesitation, putting himself in harm's way to protect his commanding officer and his brothers in arms. That Daniel's actions that day were why the general was standing here now, why he'd had the chance to see his own children grow up, why he'd lived to earn those stars on his uniform. Emma couldn't breathe. The military had told her Daniel died in combat. They'd said he died with honor. But they'd never told her this. They'd never told her he was a hero, that he'd saved lives, that his death had meant something beyond just another casualty in a distant war. The general's voice dropped even lower. He said he'd tried to find Emma after Daniel's death. He'd wanted to tell her personally what her brother had done, what kind of man he'd been. But she'd moved, changed addresses during those dark months when she was drowning in grief and barely holding her life together. The military had lost track of her, and the general's inquiries had gone nowhere. He'd carried the guilt of that failure for 12 years, wondering if Daniel's sister knew what her brother had done, if she understood the magnitude of his sacrifice. And now, by pure chance in a hotel hallway, he'd found her. Or rather, he'd found the jacket. The worn, faded, threadbare jacket that had become a target for mockery and cruelty just minutes ago. The jacket that these wealthy women had laughed at, that the blonde woman had touched with disdain, as if poverty were contagious. The general turned to look at those women now. They were still there, frozen in place, their faces showing various degrees of shame and horror as they realized what they'd done. They'd mocked a dead soldier's jacket. They'd laughed at a grieving sister wearing the only piece of her brother she had left. They'd treated Emma like trash because of the very garment that represented sacrifice and heroism and love. The general's expression hardened, his tears dried up, replaced by something cold and commanding. When he spoke to those women, his voice carried the weight of authority built over decades of military service. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer blow. He asked if they understood what they'd done, if they had any concept of what that jacket represented, if they had ever sacrificed anything, ever put someone else's life before their own comfort, ever thought about anything beyond their next shopping trip or lunch date. The women couldn't meet his eyes. The blonde who'd touched the jacket looked like she might be sick. But the general wasn't finished. He turned to the growing crowd of onlookers and raised his voice so everyone could hear. He told them about Daniel Clark, about a young man from a poor family who'd joined the military to serve his country, about a soldier who'd exemplified everything good about service and sacrifice, about a hero who died saving the lives of 7 men, including the general himself, about a sister who'd honored his memory the only way she could, by keeping his jacket close, by wearing it despite its condition, by refusing to let go of the last physical connection she had to her brother. Emma stood in the hotel hallway, her world spinning as the general's words washed over her. The crowd around them had grown larger, hotel staff and guests drawn by the commotion. She could see Mrs. Chen at the edge of the group, her stern face softened with something that looked like understanding. The blonde woman and her friends had melted back into the crowd, their faces red with shame. Though Emma barely registered them anymore, they didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the truth that was finally, after 12 years, coming to light. The general composed himself, straightening his uniform and wiping his face with a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. But he didn't move away from Emma. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. He asked if they could talk somewhere private, somewhere he could tell her everything about Daniel's last days, about the kind of soldier and person he'd been. There was so much she didn't know, so much he wanted to share with her. Emma nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. A hotel manager, a man in a crisp suit who'd pushed through the crowd, immediately offered his office. He looked at Emma with new eyes now, not as a lowly cleaner but as someone worthy of respect. It was amazing, Emma thought distantly, how quickly people's attitudes could change when they learned your story, when they saw you as human instead of invisible. The manager's office was on the 3rd floor, a plush space with leather furniture and dark wood paneling. The general waited until Emma was seated before taking a chair across from her. Someone brought water and coffee, and the manager quietly closed the door as he left, giving them privacy. Emma's hands shook as she held the water glass, and she had to set it down for fear of spilling it. The general began to talk. He told Emma about the day Daniel arrived at the unit, fresh out of training, eager and nervous, and determined to prove himself. He'd been assigned to the general's command in a forward operating base, one of the dangerous postings where every day brought new threats. Daniel had been young, only 20 years old, but he'd adapted quickly, earning the respect of the more experienced soldiers with his work ethic and his willingness to learn. Emma listened, hungry for every detail. She hadn't known any of this. Daniel's letters had been upbeat but vague, never sharing the hard parts, never wanting to worry her. He'd written about the landscape, about the other soldiers becoming like brothers, about the sense of purpose he felt, but he'd never mentioned the danger, never let on how scared he must have been sometimes. The general described training exercises where Daniel excelled, showing a natural aptitude for tactical thinking. He talked about quiet moments in the barracks where Daniel would write letters home, letters to Emma, always to Emma. The other soldiers teased him about it, called him a mama's boy, but Daniel never cared. He'd told them about his sister who'd raised him after their mother died, who'd given up her own dreams to take care of him, who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. He'd told them he was going to make something of himself so he could pay her back, take care of her the way she'd taken care of him. Emma's tears flowed freely now. She'd never known Daniel felt that way. He'd been 17 when their mother passed, and Emma had done what she had to do because he was her little brother and she loved him. She'd never expected gratitude or repayment. She just wanted him to have a chance at a better life than hers. And he'd join the military partially because it was a way to relieve her financial burden, to support himself and send money home. She'd begged him not to enlist, afraid of losing him. But he'd been so determined, so sure it was the right path. The general's voice grew heavier as he moved toward describing the mission that claimed Daniel's life. It had been a routine patrol, or as routine as anything could be in a war zone. The general had been visiting the forward base, meeting with commanders and assessing operations. Daniel's unit had been assigned to escort him to a meeting with local allies in a nearby village. Intelligence suggested the route was clear, but intelligence was never perfect. They'd been halfway to the village when Daniel spotted something. A disturbance in the dirt by the roadside, a pattern that didn't quite fit the natural landscape. Years later, the general still marveled at how Daniel had seen it when more experienced soldiers missed it. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was divine intervention. Whatever it was, Daniel had seen the improvised explosive device buried in the road ahead, positioned perfectly to destroy the vehicle carrying the general and 6 other soldiers. Daniel had shouted a warning, but there wasn't time to stop the convoy safely. The vehicles were heavy, the road narrow with deep ditches on either side. Stopping suddenly might have triggered the explosive anyway, or caused a collision that would leave them vulnerable to follow-up attack. In that split second, with the lead vehicle bearing down on the hidden bomb, Daniel made a choice. He jumped from his position in the rear vehicle and ran forward, waving his arms, putting himself directly in the path of the lead vehicle to force it to stop. The driver saw him and slammed on the brakes, bringing the convoy to a lurching halt just yards from the buried explosive. For a moment, everyone thought the crisis was averted. The bomb squad could be called in to disarm the device safely. Daniel had saved them all. But the insurgents who'd planted the bomb were watching. They'd anticipated the possibility of discovery and had a backup plan. As the soldiers dismounted to secure the area, enemy fire erupted from the hills overlooking the road. It was a coordinated ambush, carefully planned, and Daniel was the most exposed target, standing in the open where he'd stopped the convoy. The general's voice broke as he described what happened next. How Daniel had taken multiple hits in the first seconds of the firefight. How he'd gone down hard on the dusty road, while the other soldiers scrambled for cover and returned fire. How the general himself, protected by his body armor and the vehicle frame, had been spared. How the firefight had lasted 15 minutes that felt like hours, until air support arrived and drove the attackers away. By the time the medics reached Daniel, it was too late. He'd lost too much blood, taken too many wounds, but he'd been conscious to the end, and his last words had been a question. He'd asked if everyone else was okay. Even dying on a roadside thousands of miles from home, his concern had been for his fellow soldiers, for the men he'd saved with his quick thinking and selfless courage. Emma couldn't hold back her sobs anymore. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. It wasn't new grief she'd mourned Daniel for 12 years, but hearing the details made it fresh again, raw and aching like an open wound. The general gave her time, sitting in respectful silence until she could breathe again. When Emma finally looked up, wiping her eyes with the tissue someone had thoughtfully left on the desk, the general continued. He told her about the aftermath, about how Daniel's actions had been documented and recognized. Daniel had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star for Valor, a high military honor. The medal was in storage somewhere in a military facility, the general said, because they'd never been able to locate next of kin to present it properly. Emma had moved during those dark months after Daniel's death, and the military's attempts to find her had failed. Emma felt numb. Her brother was a decorated war hero, and she'd never known. All these years, she'd thought he was just another casualty, another name on a long list of the fallen. She'd been proud of him for serving, heartbroken that he'd died, but she'd never known the full story. She'd never known he'd saved 7 lives, that he'd acted with such courage and clarity in his final moments, that the military had tried to honor him but couldn't find her to complete the ceremony. The general reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a card, pressing it into Emma's hand. It had his name, General Marcus Patterson, and several phone numbers. He told her to call him, that he would personally ensure Daniel's Silver Star was presented to her properly, with full military honors. More than that, he wanted to connect her with the other 6 men Daniel had saved that day. They'd all survived the war, all gone on to live full lives thanks to her brother's sacrifice. They deserved to meet her, to thank her, to tell her their own stories about Daniel. Emma looked at the card through blurred vision. General Marcus Patterson, a man of obvious importance, decorated and respected, taking time to sit with a hotel cleaner and share memories of her dead brother. The kindness of it overwhelmed her. For so long she'd been invisible, dismissed, overlooked, and now this general was treating her like she mattered, like her grief and her loss were important. There was a soft knock on the door, and Mrs. Chen entered quietly. She looked at Emma with an expression Emma had never seen before, something gentle and concerned. Mrs. Chen said Emma should take the rest of the day off, that someone else would cover her remaining rooms. She should go home, rest, process everything she'd learned, and she shouldn't worry about the time it would be paid. Emma started to protest. She couldn't afford to lose half a day's wages, even with pay. But the general interrupted her. He stood, drawing himself up to his full height, and fixed Mrs. Chen with a look that made the supervisor straighten her own spine. He stated that Emma wouldn't be losing anything. In fact, he intended to speak with the hotel's general manager about Emma's situation. He made it clear, in the way only a person of authority could, that this conversation was going to happen and changes were going to be made. Mrs. Chen nodded quickly and excused herself. After she left, the general turned back to Emma with a softer expression. He told her that Daniel had talked about her constantly, about how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed, how worried he was that she was wearing herself out trying to survive. Daniel's dream, the general said, had been to finish his service and use his military benefits to help Emma get back to school, to pursue that teaching degree she'd abandoned. He'd had plans, hopes for a future where he could pay back all she'd done for him. Emma felt like her heart might shatter. She'd had no idea. Daniel had never mentioned any of this in his letters. He'd just written cheerful notes about his training, about the friends he was making, about the places he was seeing. He'd sent her money when he could, small amounts that had helped more than he probably knew, but he'd never talked about his larger plans or dreams for their future. The general said something else, something that made Emma's breath catch. He said he'd failed Daniel by not finding Emma sooner, by not making sure she knew what her brother had done and how much he'd meant to his unit. He'd carried that failure for 12 years, and now that chance had given him an opportunity to make it right. He wasn't going to waste it. He was going to help her, whether she wanted it or not, because that's what Daniel would have wanted. Emma tried to argue, to say she didn't need charity, that she was managing fine on her own. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. She wasn't managing fine. She was surviving, barely, in an endless cycle of work and exhaustion and loneliness. Pride had kept her going, the stubborn refusal to give up that seemed to run in her family. But pride didn't pay bills or fill the emptiness inside her. The general was gentle but firm. This wasn't charity, he said. This was a debt of honor. 7 men owed their lives to her brother, and by extension to her family. He himself had 3 children who would never have been born if Daniel hadn't saved his life that day. He had grandchildren now, a whole life he'd been able to live because a 20-year-old soldier from a poor family had quick eyes and a courageous heart. How could he not help that soldier's sister when he finally had the chance? Emma didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence and dignity. But another part, a part she'd kept buried for years, was tired. So tired of struggling alone, so tired of being invisible and poor and forgotten. If accepting help was what Daniel would have wanted, if it honored his memory somehow, maybe she could allow it. Maybe she could let someone help carry the weight for once. The general gave her his personal cell phone number and made her promise to call him within the next few days. They needed to arrange the proper presentation of Daniel's silver star, and the general wanted to organize a meeting with the other survivors from that day. He also wanted to discuss practical matters, Emma's living situation, her job, her future. He'd made a lot of connections over his military career, he said with a slight smile. He knew people who knew people. Maybe there were opportunities she hadn't considered, paths forward she couldn't see from where she currently stood. Emma left the hotel manager's office in a daze. The general walked with her, ignoring the stares of hotel staff and guests as he escorted the cleaning woman through the lobby like she was someone important. At the service entrance, he shook her hand formally, then surprised her by pulling her into a brief, firm hug. He whispered that Daniel would be proud of her, proud of how she'd survived, how she'd kept going despite everything. That meant more to Emma than any promise of future help. She rode the bus home with the general's card clutched in her hand and her brother's jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The other passengers gave her curious looks. A crying woman in a cleaning uniform was unusual enough, but the intensity of her emotion must have shown on her face. Emma didn't care. For the first time in 12 years, she felt like she could breathe properly. The weight that had been crushing her chest since the day the military officers came to her door with news of Daniel's death had lifted just slightly. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. Her studio apartment looked the same as always when she walked in, small, shabby, with second-hand furniture and walls that needed painting. But Emma saw it differently now. This wasn't a prison of poverty. This was the place where Daniel's sister lived, where she'd survived and persisted and honored his memory by refusing to give up. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was hers, and she'd earned every inch of it through hard work and determination. Daniel would understand that. Daniel did understand that. Emma carefully removed the jacket and laid it on her bed. She'd worn it so long it had become like a second skin, but now she looked at it with fresh eyes. The faded fabric, the worn cuffs, the stuck zipper, none of that mattered. What mattered was the patch on the sleeve, the unit insignia that represented courage and sacrifice, and a love so deep it transcended death. Her brother had worn this jacket during training, during his early days of service, before he deployed to the place where he would die. His body had been in this jacket, his arms had filled these sleeves. And now Emma's did, carrying on, living the life he'd made possible through his sacrifice. She thought about the women in the hotel hallway, how they'd laughed and mocked and judged her based on her appearance. Their cruelty had hurt, cutting deep into wounds that never quite healed. But now she felt something else: pity for them. They lived in a world so shallow that they measured worth by clothes and possessions, where a worn jacket was grounds for mockery rather than curiosity about the story behind it. They would never understand what this jacket meant, what any object carried with love could mean. Their expensive clothes and designer bags were just things, status symbols without soul. Emma's jacket was memory and love and connection to someone irreplaceable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Emma tried to rest but couldn't sleep. Her mind was too full of everything the general had told her, every detail about Daniel's last days and his heroic final act. She'd spent 12 years with only the bare facts: killed in action, died honorably, serving his country. Now she had the full story, and it was both better and worse than not knowing. Better because she understood the magnitude of what he'd done, the lives he'd saved, the man he'd become. Worse because the details made the loss more concrete, more real, more devastating. As evening fell and shadows filled her small apartment, Emma made a decision. She called the number on the general's card, half expecting to get voicemail. But he answered on the second ring, his voice warm and immediate, like he'd been waiting for her call. Emma told him she wanted to accept his help, wanted to meet the other soldiers Daniel had saved, wanted to receive her brother's medal properly. But more than that, she wanted to know if there was a way, any way, to honor Daniel's memory by helping other people. Maybe veterans' families who'd lost someone. Maybe young soldiers who needed support. Maybe just people who were struggling the way she'd struggled. Invisible and forgotten and alone. The general was quiet for a moment, and Emma could hear the emotion in his voice when he finally spoke. He said that was exactly the kind of thing Daniel's sister would say, and he would be honored to help make it happen. 3 weeks later, Emma stood in a very different place than the hotel hallway where her life had changed. She was at a military base 2 hours outside the city, in a ceremony hall filled with soldiers, veterans, and families. The room gleamed with polish and pride, American flags hanging from the walls alongside unit banners and historical photographs. Emma wore a new dress, simple but nice, purchased with money. General Patterson had insisted she accept as a loan until she got on her feet. Her brother's jacket was at home now, carefully cleaned and preserved in a special box the general had arranged, protected but still hers to hold whenever she needed to feel close to Daniel. The presentation ceremony for Daniel's Silver Star was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Emma sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. To her left sat General Patterson in his full dress uniform, and to her right were 6 men of varying ages, all of them veterans, all of them alive because of her brother. The 7th man whose life Daniel had saved had passed away 2 years ago from cancer, but his widow and adult children were there, sitting in the row behind Emma, present to honor the soldier who'd given their husband and father extra years of life. Emma had met all of them over the past weeks, these men who owed their lives to Daniel. Each meeting had been emotional and overwhelming and healing in ways Emma hadn't expected. They'd shared stories about her brother, filling in gaps in her knowledge, painting a picture of who Daniel had been when he wasn't writing careful letters home. She'd learned he had a wicked sense of humor, that he could fix almost anything mechanical, that he'd been terrible at poker but played anyway, that he'd helped younger soldiers through homesickness and fear with patience and kindness. The first man she'd met was James Rodriguez, who'd been driving the lead vehicle that day. James was 42 now, married with 4 kids, working as a high school coach in Texas. He'd flown up specifically for this ceremony, bringing his whole family because he wanted his children to see the man who'd saved their father. James had cried when he met Emma, apologizing over and over for not finding her sooner, for not making sure she knew what Daniel had done. Emma had told him there was nothing to apologize for, that just meeting him and seeing the life he'd built was gift enough. Then there was Marcus Chen, no relation to Emma's supervisor at the hotel despite the shared last name. Marcus had been the youngest soldier in the convoy, just 19 at the time, and Daniel had taken him under his wing during training. Marcus was a doctor now, working in emergency medicine at a hospital in San Francisco. He'd told Emma that Daniel had inspired him to pursue medicine, to find a way to save lives the way Daniel had saved his. Every patient Marcus helped, he said, was partly thanks to her brother's example. The others had similar stories. David Thompson, now a school principal in Ohio, with 3 daughters who would never have been born if Daniel hadn't seen that bomb. William Foster, who'd used his military benefits to become an engineer and now designed safety systems for construction sites, driven by Daniel's example of watching out for others. Tyler Jackson, who'd struggled with survivor's guilt for years, but had finally found peace working with other veterans, helping them transition back to civilian life. And Raymond Hayes, who'd been the oldest soldier in the convoy at 35, now retired and spending his time volunteering with youth organizations, trying to give back what Daniel's sacrifice had given him. Each of these men had brought their families, their wives and children and grandchildren, 3 generations of life that existed because Daniel Clark had quick eyes and a brave heart. Looking at all these people, Emma had felt overwhelmed by the ripple effect of her brother's single act. He'd saved 7 lives directly, but indirectly, he'd made possible dozens more. All these children and grandchildren, these futures that wouldn't exist if Daniel hadn't stopped that convoy. The weight of that realization had been almost too much to bear. But General Patterson had helped her through it, meeting with her multiple times to talk not just about Daniel, but about her own life and future. True to his word, the general had used his connections to create opportunities Emma never could have imagined. The hotel had offered her a promotion to front desk staff, with better pay and hours, though Emma had ultimately decided not to take it. The general had introduced her to people in education, reigniting her long-dead dream of teaching. Now she was enrolled in online classes to complete her degree, funded by a scholarship from a military family foundation that General Patterson sat on the board of. She'd also started working part-time at a veterans support center, helping families navigate the complicated world of military benefits and support services. The changes had come fast, almost too fast, and sometimes Emma felt dizzy trying to keep up. Her studio apartment was the same, but she'd been approved for a better place and would move next month. Her bank account, which had always hovered near zero, now had a small cushion that let her breathe easier. She had health insurance for the first time in years. She had a future that looked like something more than just survival, and it was all because she'd worn her brother's jacket to work on a day when a general happened to be walking through a hotel hallway. The ceremony hall doors opened, and a military honor guard marched in with precise steps, their boots clicking in unison on the polished floor. Emma's heart began to race. This was real. This was happening. After 12 years of quiet grieving, of wearing that jacket and wondering if anyone besides her remembered Daniel Clark, she was about to see her brother honored the way he deserved. General Patterson stood, and everyone in the room followed his lead. He took Emma's hand and squeezed it gently, a gesture of support and reassurance, then guided her to stand at the front of the room. The 6 veterans who'd been saved that day lined up behind her, standing at attention. The ceremony was explained in advance, but Emma's mind felt fuzzy, like she was watching everything happen from a distance. A colonel she'd been introduced to earlier began speaking, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. He talked about Daniel's service, his dedication, his character. He described the mission and the ambush in clinical military terms, but the words couldn't hide the magnitude of what had happened. He read from Daniel's service record, listing commendations and evaluations that showed a young soldier who'd been marked for great things, who'd been promoted faster than usual because his abilities and leadership were so evident. Then came the part Emma had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. The colonel opened a polished wooden box and lifted out the silver star, the metal gleaming under the ceremony hall lights. He read the official citation, the words that would forever be part of Daniel's military record, describing his actions on that day 12 years ago. The citation talked about valor and selflessness and sacrifice, about a soldier who'd placed the lives of his brothers in arms above his own safety, without hesitation. General Patterson stepped forward to accept the medal on behalf of Daniel's family. But instead of simply taking it and handing it to Emma, he did something Emma hadn't expected. He turned to face her directly, standing at attention, and began to speak without notes or script. He talked about Daniel not as a general describing a fallen soldier, but as a man who'd been saved talking about his savior. His voice filled with emotion as he described those final moments of Daniel's life, details he hadn't shared before. How Daniel had managed to smile, even as he lay dying, had made a joke about how this was a hell of a way to get out of latrine duty. How he'd asked them to tell his sister he loved her, that he was sorry he wouldn't be able to come home and help her like he'd planned. How even facing death, Daniel's concern had been for everyone else, for the soldiers around him, for the mission, for Emma back home who he knew would be heartbroken. The general's voice broke, and he paused to compose himself. The entire room was silent except for quiet crying. Emma could feel tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. This was a moment for tears, for grief, for love that transcended death and time. General Patterson continued, saying he'd made a promise to Daniel in those final moments. He'd promised that Daniel's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that his story would be told, that his sister would be taken care of. He'd carried that promise for 12 years, unable to fulfill it, haunted by the failure. But now, through what could only be called fate or providence or divine intervention, he'd been given a chance to make good on that promise, and he intended to honor it fully. The general turned back to the medal in its box and lifted it carefully. He approached Emma and spoke directly to her, his words formal but weighted with personal emotion. He presented the silver star to Emma on behalf of a grateful nation, on behalf of the United States military, and on behalf of 7 men and their families who owed everything to Specialist Daniel Clark's courage. Emma's hands shook as she accepted the medal. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real, and incredibly precious. This small piece of metal represented her brother's final moments, his choice to act when action was dangerous, his love for the men he served with. She held it like the treasure it was, pressing it to her chest, feeling the weight of it over her heart. But the ceremony wasn't over. General Patterson had one more surprise. He gestured to the 6 veterans standing behind Emma, and they came forward one by one. Each man approached Emma, saluted her formally, then broke protocol to embrace her, or shake her hand while telling her what her brother meant to them. Some could barely speak through their tears. Others shared quick memories that made Emma laugh through her own crying. All of them made it clear that they lived their lives trying to be worthy of the gift Daniel had given them. The last to approach was James Rodriguez, the driver who'd slammed on the brakes when Daniel ran into the road. James pulled an envelope from his jacket and pressed it into Emma's hand. He explained that all 7 men, the 6 living and the family of the one who'd passed, had contributed to something for her. Inside the envelope was a check. Not for a small amount, but for enough money to make a real difference. James said it wasn't payment, because no amount could repay what Daniel had given. But they wanted her to have options, opportunities, freedom to choose her own path forward, without the crushing weight of poverty limiting her. Emma tried to refuse, to say it was too much, but James cut her off gently. He told her about his 4 kids, about coaching Little League and attending school concerts and walking his daughter down the aisle at her wedding last year. None of that would have happened without Daniel. This money, these resources, they came with only one condition: that Emma use them to build a life Daniel would be proud of, to pursue dreams he'd wanted her to achieve. The formal ceremony concluded, but people lingered, no one quite ready to leave. Emma found herself surrounded by families. Children who'd never met Daniel but knew his story. Wives who'd hugged their husbands a little tighter after learning how close they'd come to widowhood. An older woman approached, the widow of the 7th soldier, and took Emma's hands in hers. She thanked Emma for raising such an extraordinary young man, said that her late husband had spoken of Daniel often, had credited him with the extra years they'd had together. Those years had included the birth of a granddaughter and a renewal of their wedding vows, and a trip to Ireland they'd dreamed of their whole marriage. All gifts from Daniel's sacrifice. Emma was overwhelmed, exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but also filled with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope that barely kept her going through hard times, but real, solid hope for a future that looked bright instead of bleak. She had resources now, and education opportunities, and most importantly, she had connections. She had General Patterson, who'd become something like a father figure, checking in on her regularly and offering guidance. She had the 6 veterans and their families who'd embraced her as part of their extended clan, inviting her to holidays and celebrations. She had purpose again, channeled through her work at the Veterans Center, where she could help other families navigate the aftermath of loss. The weeks following the ceremony brought more changes. Emma moved into a new apartment, a real 1-bedroom in a better neighborhood, with actual heat that worked and windows that closed properly. She continued her online classes, finding that she enjoyed studying again, that her brain wasn't too old or too tired to learn. She kept working at the Veterans Center, where her unique combination of personal experience and genuine compassion made her invaluable to families struggling with loss or the complications of military bureaucracy. The hotel called once, Mrs. Chen, reaching out to say they'd heard about the ceremony and wanted to apologize for not recognizing Emma's situation sooner. They offered her the front desk position again, with even better terms. Emma politely declined, but thanked them for the opportunity. That part of her life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a different Emma who'd been invisible and overlooked. The new Emma had found her voice and her value. The blonde woman from the hotel hallway reached out too, somehow tracking down Emma's contact information through the hotel. Her message was apologetic and rambling, full of excuses and explanations that Emma didn't particularly want to hear. But the woman had included a substantial donation to the Veterans Center in Daniel's name, so Emma sent a brief thank you note and left it at that. Some people learned from their mistakes, and some people just tried to buy their way out of guilt. Either way, it wasn't Emma's problem anymore. General Patterson became a regular presence in Emma's life, meeting her for coffee every few weeks to check on her progress and share military stories. He'd taken a genuine interest in her education and career development, introducing her to people in his network who could offer guidance or opportunities. Through one of these connections, Emma was offered a position as a liaison between the military and local school districts, helping military families with children navigate educational challenges. It was perfect, combining her interest in education with her understanding of military life and her natural empathy for struggling families. 6 months after the ceremony, Emma attended her first college graduation since dropping out 23 years earlier. She'd completed enough online courses to walk at commencement, receiving her bachelor's degree in education with honors. General Patterson attended, sitting with the 6 veterans and their families in a section they'd reserved specifically for Emma's guests. When her name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, they all stood and applauded, making enough noise that the entire auditorium noticed. Emma had cried then, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her from that hotel hallway to this moment. She thought about Daniel constantly during the ceremony, wishing he could see this, knowing somehow he did. She was wearing a new jacket, professional and well-fitted, and appropriate for a graduate, but she'd pinned Daniel's unit patch to the inside collar where it rested against her heart. That patch went with her everywhere now, a permanent reminder of sacrifice and love and the price of freedom. Emma's work at the Veterans Center expanded. She started a specific program for siblings of fallen soldiers, recognizing that their grief was often overlooked in favor of parents and spouses. These siblings had lost brothers and sisters who'd been heroes, but also friends and playmates and parts of their childhood. Emma understood that loss intimately, and her support groups became a lifeline for others struggling with similar pain. General Patterson helped her secure funding for the program, and within a year, it had expanded to 3 other cities. The media caught wind of Emma's story, the cleaning woman wearing her dead hero brother's jacket who'd been mocked by wealthy hotel guests, only to have a general recognize the patch and reveal the truth. It was the kind of human interest story that captured attention, especially with the viral video that someone had recorded of the confrontation in the hotel hallway. That video had spread across social media, with millions of views and countless comments condemning the women who'd mocked Emma and praising the general who'd honored her brother. Emma was reluctant about the publicity at first, uncomfortable with attention after so many years of invisibility. But General Patterson convinced her that her story could do good, could shine light on the families of fallen soldiers who often struggled in silence and poverty. So Emma agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, using the platform to talk about Daniel and his sacrifice, about the ripple effects of heroism, about the veterans' families who needed support and recognition. The interviews led to speaking engagements. Emma found herself telling Daniel's story at military bases, veterans events, and memorial services. She wasn't a natural public speaker at first, nervous and stumbling over words, but passion carried her through, and eventually she found her rhythm. She spoke from the heart about loss and resilience and the power of remembering. She shared the lessons she'd learned about not judging people by appearances, about how everyone carries invisible burdens, about the importance of honoring sacrifice. A year after the ceremony, on the anniversary of Daniel's death, Emma returned to the military cemetery where he was buried. She'd visited regularly over the years, but always alone, always in quiet grief. This time was different. General Patterson was there, along with all 6 veterans and their families. They'd come from across the country to stand with Emma at Daniel's grave, to mark not just his death, but his life and legacy. James Rodriguez had arranged for a new headstone, larger than the standard military marker, with Daniel's citation engraved on it, so future visitors would know what this soldier had done. The installation ceremony was simple. Just Emma's extended military family gathered around the grave, sharing memories and tears and laughter as they remembered a 20-year-old who'd become a hero in his final moments. Emma placed her hand on the new headstone, tracing the engraved words with her fingers. The cold granite held no warmth, but Emma felt her brother's presence anyway. She told him about the year she'd had, about the changes and opportunities and the life she was building. She told him about the families she was helping and the program she'd started and the degree she'd earned. She told him she was going to be okay, that he could rest easy knowing his sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that his sister was finally living instead of just surviving. As the sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones, Emma realized something profound. Daniel's death had broken her, had sent her into a spiral of grief and poverty and isolation that had lasted 12 years. But Daniel's life, the truth about who he'd been and what he'd done, had saved her. The worn jacket that people had mocked had carried her through the dark years, a tangible connection to her brother when she had nothing else. And that jacket had ultimately led her back to life, back to purpose, back to a future worth living. The blonde woman's cruelty in that hotel hallway had been a catalyst, painful but necessary. If General Patterson hadn't been there that exact day, if he hadn't seen that patch, Emma might have continued in her quiet suffering for years more. The universe had brought them together in that moment for a reason, connecting past and present, debt and repayment, loss and redemption. Emma's story spread further, beyond military circles into mainstream consciousness. She was invited to speak at schools and community centers, sharing Daniel's story with young people who needed to understand the real cost of freedom. She talked about her brother not as a distant hero, but as a real person, a kid who'd loved video games and terrible action movies, who'd been scared of spiders, who'd sung off-key in the shower. She made him human and relatable, then showed how ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The speaking engagements led to a book deal. Publishers wanted Emma to write about her experience, about the years of poverty and grief, about the moment in the hotel hallway that changed everything. Emma was hesitant, but General Patterson encouraged her. The book could reach people her speaking never would, could provide comfort to others suffering similar losses, could ensure Daniel's story lived on long after everyone who'd known him was gone. Emma wrote the book over 18 months, working with a co-author who helped shape her memories and emotions into coherent narrative. The process was painful, forcing her to relive every difficult moment, but also therapeutic in ways she hadn't anticipated. Putting words to grief made it somehow more manageable, more finite. She could close the manuscript and set it aside, instead of carrying the weight in her chest every waking moment. The book, titled The Worn Jacket, became a surprise bestseller. Readers connected with Emma's honest portrayal of poverty and loss, with her journey from invisibility to purpose. Veterans' families found comfort in seeing their own struggles reflected on the page. Teachers used it in classrooms to discuss sacrifice and service. Support groups for bereaved siblings adopted it as recommended reading. All royalties from the book went into a foundation. Emma established the Daniel Clark Foundation for Veterans Families. The foundation provided financial support, educational opportunities, and counseling services to families of fallen soldiers, particularly siblings, whose grief was often overlooked. General Patterson served on the board, along with the 6 veterans Daniel had saved. They funded scholarships, emergency financial assistance, and support groups across the country. 3 years after that day in the hotel hallway, Emma stood in a very different place. She was the executive director of a growing foundation, a published author, a sought-after speaker, and most importantly, someone who'd transformed pain into purpose. She had a master's degree now, continuing her education even as she helped others access theirs. She had a network of friends and colleagues who valued her insights and experience. She had a life that mattered, that made a difference, that honored her brother's memory in tangible ways. The worn jacket hung in Emma's home office now, professionally preserved in a climate-controlled case, the patch prominently displayed. She didn't wear it anymore. It had become too precious, too important to risk damage. But she visited it daily, touching the glass case like touching a talisman. That jacket had carried her through the darkest years of her life, had protected her from the cold, had given her comfort when nothing else could, and ultimately, it had saved her. Just as surely as Daniel had saved those 7 soldiers. Emma sometimes thought about the blonde woman who'd mocked her, wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience or just moved on to other cruelties. The video of that confrontation still circulated online occasionally, resurfacing whenever someone shared it as an example of karmic justice or the danger of judging by appearances. Emma had moved beyond anger or even satisfaction at the woman's public shaming. That moment had been a gift, disguised as humiliation, that had connected her to people who changed her life. General Patterson remained a constant presence, having become the father figure Emma never really had. He attended her speaking engagements when he could, introduced her to influential people who could further the foundation's work, and checked in regularly just to see how she was doing. He'd once told Emma that Daniel had saved his life, but Emma had saved his soul. He'd carried guilt about not finding her for 12 years, and being able to help her had lifted that burden in ways he couldn't quite express. The 6 veterans and their families had become Emma's chosen family. She attended their children's graduations and weddings. She was godmother to James Rodriguez's youngest daughter. She spent holidays rotating between their homes, never alone anymore unless she chose to be. They'd all found healing in their connection, in the shared understanding of what Daniel's sacrifice had meant and continued to mean. On quiet evenings, Emma would sit in her comfortable home, no longer a shabby studio, but a real house she'd purchased with book royalties and foundation income, and reflect on the journey that had brought her here. From invisible cleaning woman in a worn jacket to published author and foundation director, from poor and overlooked to financially stable and respected, from drowning in grief to swimming in purpose. But the most important change wasn't external. Emma had found peace with Daniel's death. She would always miss him, would always wish he'd lived to see the life she'd built, but the sharp pain of loss had softened into bittersweet remembrance. She could think of him now and smile more often than she cried. She could celebrate what he'd done, instead of only mourning what he'd lost. The foundation continued to grow, helping hundreds of families each year. Emma hired staff who'd been through similar losses, creating jobs while building a team that truly understood the people they served. The program for siblings of fallen soldiers expanded to 20 cities. They added support for children who'd lost parents in service. They partnered with schools and universities to provide educational pathways for military families. Emma's speaking career flourished. She traveled the country telling Daniel's story, but more importantly, telling the stories of the families she served through the foundation. She gave voice to the invisible people, the ones struggling in poverty and grief, the ones society overlooked just as she'd been overlooked. She became an advocate, pushing for better support systems and recognition for veterans' families. Years passed. Daniel's story became part of military culture, told in training as an example of vigilance and selfless service. His name was added to memorials and buildings at the base where he'd trained. Young soldiers learned about Specialist Daniel Clark, who'd seen what others missed and acted without hesitation, saving 7 lives at the cost of his own. Emma watched her brother's legacy grow far beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark years of poverty and grief. She saw his impact ripple outward in waves, the soldiers he'd saved, their children and grandchildren, the families the foundation helped, the people who heard the story and were inspired to their own acts of service or kindness. And through it all, that worn jacket remained the symbol of everything, of loss and love, of sacrifice and redemption, of the journey from invisible to invaluable. It reminded Emma that appearance means nothing, that true worth lies beneath the surface, that everyone has a story if others would just take the time to see it. The jacket that had been mocked in a hotel hallway had become an artifact of heroism, a tangible link to a young soldier whose courage had created ripples that would touch countless lives for generations to come. Emma Clark, once a poor cleaning woman wearing her dead brother's jacket, had become a force for good in the world. And every success, every life, changed through the foundation, every family helped through their grief, was a testament to Daniel's sacrifice. He died saving 7 soldiers, but through Emma, he'd saved countless others. That was the real legacy, not just the medal in its case or the stories told in training, but the ongoing impact of one man's courage filtering through his sister's determination to turn pain into purpose.